if you've been involved in a toxic relationship with someone with a personality disorder, and particularly if you've come out of that relationship the other side and have started to recover, one of the superpowers or curses that it leaves you with is a heightened sensitivity to that kind of behaviour, to the point where you notice it in other people's relationships. And over the last couple of weeks in the news, if you keep your eye on the internet at all or on the news anywhere, you'll see there's a lot of information going around about Johnny Depp's marriage to his now ex-wife, I believe, Amber Heard. And while I'm not really up on celebrity gossip, and I don't like to indulge too much in kind of celebrity gossip, I can't help but, as I've read and listened to some of the audio that's now been released out there, I can't help but feel a little bit spiked, as it were, triggered maybe, by listening to some of that audio. And there are plenty of videos on the internet that have covered the ins and outs of the political, social implications of that and who's right and who's wrong, and that doesn't really interest me. What brought it to my attention mainly is, first of all, the commentary, the narrative that was first out there, and now also what's happened in the last couple of weeks with certain audio tapes being released that change that narrative slightly. And listening to some of that audio particularly the way that the two of them have fought, I can't help but recognise some of that behaviour, and it's actually quite traumatic to listen to again, because some of the detail and some of the method of arguing in that is so similar to what I went through, that it sparks certain emotions. And I guess I should make clear before I go into any detail on this that as I said, I'm not really interested in the particular individuals in this. It just happens to be in the public domain at the moment. And B, there are plenty of people that have covered this in a lot of detail from a political and social point of view. And also Dr. Grande, who I'm a fan of his channel, who does a very kind of clinical breakdown of personality disorders, actually covered this particular topic in detail, though he didn't really come to any sort of major conclusions. But I'll put a link to his video below as well. And before I go into the details of it, obviously this is an ongoing legal case, so let me put the caveats in that these are all allegations based on certain evidence that's been released. I'm also not a qualified professional, so I'm not trying to come to any conclusions of any diagnosis of anyone. This is just my observations from what I've seen that's out in the public domain at the moment. And I'll also try and bring it around to what's the point? What point am I trying to make here in terms of if you're involved in a toxic relationship, which I'll come on to. But my summary of it, my takeaway is, as I listen to the recordings that have just been released between Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, my instant thought listening to the way those arguments went was that this is someone who's suffering, and I mean in terms of the female in this relationship, is someone who's suffering from borderline personality disorder at the very least. Whether it's narcissistic personality disorder, I don't get enough detail there to think that it reminds me of that, and to an extent I don't think it's really relevant. I'm not a huge fan of thinking of borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality as two different things. It's, for me, that they're categorizations of symptoms for someone who has a very similar kind of inner wound, as it were. But the way that the argument was unfolding, particularly around the suggestions of aggression, the suggestions of violence, but also the reluctance to let the other partner walk away and feeling like they're abandoning you, that they're not willing to fight for a relationship. Those are classic symptoms that I recognize that are very, very, what I would call borderline types of arguments, where there is no rational argument to it. There's admittance, almost an acceptance that someone gets angry, like it's an okay thing, that it's okay, and it's a sign of love that someone is willing to get so angry that they'll physically fight. And that a relationship's worth getting physical over. And it's, like I said, it was very hard for me to listen to those recordings, but I couldn't help but think that this is someone who's suffering. It's in a toxic relationship, and obviously it's ended, so someone had the strength to. But these are classic signs of borderline personality disorder, in my opinion. And if you go further into the evidence, there's a lot of allegations of multiple partners while they're going through the divorce, and it seems like the classic sign of borderline personality disorder, of not being able to be alone, of having a fear of being alone, of having an irrational emotional response to your perception of being alone, of someone going into a separate hotel room to go and avoid a physical fight, and also that escalation of emotion and completely irrational arguing when someone on the other hand, as per the audio recording, is just trying to walk away and do the sensible thing. And again, this isn't to appoint blame to anyone. It just seemed very, very vividly kind of similar, I guess, is kind of what it reminded me of. And while that's all very interesting, it brought me to a very key point, that if you know anything about the story of that relationship, this really became public with allegations of physical abuse from Johnny Depp to his wife, going through domestic violence. And actually what appears, and again, appears by the evidence presented at the moment, it appears actually this is potentially the opposite story, that actually the physical abuse was in the opposite direction. And if you know anything about the story and the accusations made during the divorce filings from Amber Heard to Johnny Depp, you'll also realise that she's made some pretty serious allegations, of which they seem to be, on the surface, given the evidence that's just been released, seem to be, in question. And this is where I want to bring it back to, if you're in a toxic relationship, and so what's the point of this video? And it's not really to discuss the kind of ongoing issues in a celebrity's relationship. I really don't care about that kind of thing. I hope adults are adults and they can sort things out. But what it does highlight is something I've mentioned in videos before, that if you are dealing with someone with a personality disorder, like narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, that once you've gone through and understood that, once you make the decision to leave that relationship, you need to be extremely careful. And I say this from experience, that, like I said, once that mask is off, once the game is up, that the method of abuse, the method of attack completely changes. So all the time that you're kind of under control, and all the time that you're still, within that toxic relationship, you're still being a codependent, the method will be to use emotions, to use emotional hooks, to use manipulation to bring you back in. Once you've effectively broken free, once you've awoken from the matrix, as it were, the method will change to becoming you're the enemy and going actually on the attack and trying to demonize you. And the point, if you look at the story between these two, is that can have significant implications on people's lives. It can ruin careers. It can, take someone's freedom away. The allegations and the attacks that can be made can be quite severe. So anyone going through this at the moment and looking to exit a toxic relationship, I'd reiterate again that the challenges you face between what I would call stage 2 of understanding of the awareness of the situation is very different from stage 3 of actually exiting that relationship. And the challenge is very emotional in the sense of stage 2, that it's very difficult for you to process, for you to come to terms with what's actually going on. But once you do, and once you build the resolve to exit that relationship, the challenge becomes completely different. The tone changes completely. It becomes much more of a logistical exercise. And I would always recommend, if it starts getting kind of heated, and my recommendation would always be in that stage to leave, to physically leave, to move yourself out of the house, however you can do to get physical separation to avoid this situation in the first place. But if it does start going down a dark path, then do as they've done in this case. I mean, again, check the laws in the state you're in the US or any country that you're in, but look to keep evidence if things start getting nasty. So keep audio recordings, video things if you need to. And I don't mean that in the terms of try and build an incorrect case, but definitely be conscious that you may need to defend yourself, to an extreme extent. And I guess the other thing that worries me more is when I think about the observations and how, like I said, you end up with a superpower or a super curse. Where I see this behavior in other cases, well, starts to worry me a bit more. And one of the things that was going through my mind a lot when I was exiting my relationship was the fear of how bad it could get. And I don't want this to send anyone on an emotional kind of spiral. I don't want this to trigger anyone in a way that will scare them. But there are certain cases out there, particularly that I would say resonate with me with narcissistic personality disorder, certain kind of criminal cases. There were two that come to mind. One is a Florida case, I think was Dalia DiPolito, I think her name was, that was caught in a sting trying to have her husband killed. And some of again, I'll put a link into this if you are interested, but I would caution, if you're in that situation at the moment, it can be not a very pleasant kind of case to investigate. But again, being on the receiving end of a woman's kind of target, as I say, a woman's abuse, that really resonated with me. So this was a woman who had staged to have a hitman kill her husband to receive money. Unbeknownst to her, that the person that she had used to contact a hitman actually reported her to the police, and they staged a policeman to be the hitman, and also actually went through to the extent of pretending with a crime scene at the house that he'd been executed. And what really struck me in that is the telephone conversations. If you listen to the case, the telephone conversations between her and her husband while she was in prison, and directly afterwards her to her mother, showed a very clear distinction about the emotional manipulation that can be applied, that is extremely false and extremely kind of callous and cold. And that was a real worry for me. That really kind of opened my eyes as to what the possibilities are here. And the other case is quite a famous one. I think the name is Jodi Arias, is a woman that seemed to have lured her ex-boyfriend into kind of a sexual encounter after they'd broken up, and then was convicted of killing him by stabbing and shooting, and was caught as they'd taken kind of sexually explicit pictures on a camera that was then put in a washing machine, assuming to destroy it, but actually linked her to the crime. And seeing her represent herself in court, and almost the arrogance, the denial, the sort of duping delight, as they call it, of believing, I think, that she could get away with it, and that her case was strong enough, but a strong sense of denial came over, was really difficult to watch, and really reminded me a lot of the traits. And again, once it's almost seeing her come to the realization, once she had been convicted, that actually this was happening and there was nowhere else to go, seemed to almost trigger a little bit of a acceptance in her. And that's kind of a lot of what drove me to my theory of that a lot of these people will end up in prison, and maybe that's the only way that they can change, when they have to accept that it's them. But like I said, I'll put links to these videos in the description box, but I would caution, if you are in the depths of going through this, they may not be the best thing to watch. But the overall message that I'd like to put across is, remember that once you start to leave that relationship, that the dynamic significantly changes, or can significantly change. It certainly did in my case, and it goes from an emotional, kind of turbulent relationship to actually quite a destructive relationship quite quickly, that can have severe consequences. So I'd always advise being sensible, and use these cases that are out there in public to see how bad it can get. And like I said, while I don't really care about the celebrity aspect of what's going on in public at the moment, it does drive a clear parallel as to what kind of went on in my relationship, and not to the same extent in terms of consequences financially, but in terms of the intent and the messages that went out there. It was really disturbing for me to hear. And I advise anyone that's going through that to take it as a slight warning, and learn from others, learn from other people's experience to improve your own situation and set yourself up for the best possible outcome for yourself.